ready to talk about something interesting.
I'd like to start this episode by talking about witches. The first kind of impetus for this was that I wanted to watch every show by my favorite director, and that's Junichi Sato. So while it's pretty easy to rewatch Aria and Princess Tutu and what have you, it's a bit more difficult to go through things like Strange Dawn and Pre-Tier. Anyway, I finally finished Magical Do-Re-Mi with some friends, and then moved on to Magic Users Club, the full series, as I'd already seen the OVA. And both of those featuring witches kind of had it on my mind. But then Jeff Thu dropped a video about witch waifus, and I figured I really wanted to talk about it in relation to Madoka Magica, and now seems like as good of a time as any. I'll also be drawing on one other cultural reference that I really am very familiar with, and you can see that in my channel if you look for the non-anime content, and that's the Dungeon Fighter Online witch class. With a very defined aesthetic, this Korean game kind of has this unique interpretation of what a witch could and should be. So if we kind of go from this launching point that Japanese media really took Bewitched and the Western interpretation of witches, and then transformed that into something a bit different and a bit more Japanesey, for lack of a better word, then we can really look at what constitutes the qualifications of a witch in modern anime or anime adjacent media. And then it's a pretty simple process to compare against the constituent makeup of the magical girl, as really they don't often overlap outside of Magical Do-Re-Mi or maybe Little Witch Academia. And that's despite sharing a number of similarities in intended audiences or fantasy situations and powers. But listening to the Mother's Basement video, the thing that really got me thinking was the idea that a witch implies some type of distance from society. They are women that are necessarily empowered. However, there are plenty of empowered women all throughout Japanese media and Western media. Your Captain Marvels aren't a witch. In fact, many magical girls don't live without a society, and you could very much make the argument they stand for the compassion and togetherness that creates the trust necessary for a society to form. So perhaps what differs a witch from a magical girl is that while being empowered, the witch now has a anti-societal view, or they harbor a worldview that doesn't have to match up with the dominant social structure of their time. The Dungeon Fighter Online representation of the witch is pretty much all about this. They are so far gone in their own machinations that any type of rules, even such basic morality, is pretty much things that they can choose to abide by or choose to ignore on their whims. Of course, this is why you would feel that a witch then is dangerous, because they don't abide by any of those safety and morality standards that we would attribute to leading to the collective safety of a society and its members. So whether it's a chicken and an egg problem that they gain the power and then they are able to ignore society and its norms, or that they leave society and its norms and are then empowered by it, that doesn't really matter. As a side note, that's also a really good thing that I would have liked to have had in my Adolescence of Utena breakdown. But I think we've come back at the idea of what establishes a witch, as opposed to any type of Eye of Newt or flying on a broom or any such thing. And if you think about it, that's kind of the main conflict in Kiki's delivery service, isn't it? The struggle to fit into society. And so the definition that I'll lay down for a witch, or what I see as the most functional definition for a witch, would be a woman that is no longer made to answer to society because of her intrinsic power, and vice versa. If we take that concept in and of itself, we can use it for a number of different things that really speak to the patriarchal societies of the past, our intrinsic fear of people that have a different value system than us and fall somewhere outside what we would be comfortable with, and broader things like ostracization and the value of human interaction. I think we see a lot of this manifest in episode 9. We see the transition from magical girl into witch and what that means for the value systems. Again, a magical girl is an inherent pro-social element. She relies relies on the relationships to the other people that she has built. In fact, the ultimate Madoka wish-making sequence is so destructive to the witches because of her omniscience, that she somehow sees and accepts all the burdens that the magical girls have undergone and forms this relationship to them, opening her heart to them, imbuing them with value. This is antithetical to the witches in Madoka Magica, who are portrayed as Sayaka is, of touting and spreading the idea that none of the emotional interactions that they have had any type of positive influence, or at least that any positive influence they have had has been cancelled out by the negative. This is inherently an anti-social interaction. If none of that creates any goodness unto the world, then why form any bonds with anyone? Why have any passions for other people? Why care about other people? We see this representation of a witch to be right in line with all representations of the witch, or that qualifier which we said we would judge witchiness by. A witch has a very neutral opinion to any type of social interaction. It's not that they won't do it, it's just that they don't see the purpose in it. This is why you rarely see a witch portrayed as manipulative. That type of social engineering would be far beyond what a witch needs to deal with. So this nicely continues where we left off on episode 8, with the abandonment of all these values that Sayaka once held dear. With the reduction of her into nothing but a husk, she transforms and becomes a witch. However, with this type of attitude or framing, couldn't we then consider a witch more of a neutral than an evil? Of course, our initial response to this is that the witches in this show present this type of tangible problem that needs to be addressed. They actively do hurt people and kill them and present some type of tangible negative influence on the world. But again, doesn't this break that kind of equivalence thing that Sayaka, Kyubei, and Homura all have championed? If the witch is really a neutral entity, if it creates just as much happiness as it does grief, then wouldn't you just leave it alone as it's a net neutral? And so too, I think a lot of witches are portrayed this way, that anytime a person in a modern anime or anime adjacent work encounters this witch, it's not some Snow White, very simple and basic evil character, but instead one that is going to be impossible to be able to read because you don't know and you can't know what their value systems are. But if you did, they could be treated like any other human being. That is, or the point I want to make, is that a witch is not fundamentally insane or irrational. And the use of that word and the context that goes along with it feels very intentional here, even past the pun that we saw at the end of episode 8. Again and again, I've maintained that you are being hoodwinked by the art and the writing of the beginning of Madoka Magica, that the bamboozle on the Monster of the Day formula, coupled with the grotesqueries of the Inukuri design and Urobuchi's emphasis on the tangible negative influence of the witches, puts you in a space where you are to think of these as a villain, where at the same time we are also being led, or subliminally being led, to really consider these as not only magical girls that have lost their way, but also characters in and of themselves that still have some type of personality or meaning or intelligence behind them. This, naturally, is what episode 9 is mostly about, and the nuances of it all make it a truly brilliant episode and my favorite of my favorite series. So before going through it, let's get to a couple of your comments. This one's from Clear and Sweet. He says, "Are you deliberately trying to line these up with the 10th anniversary of the show?" No, actually, that was not a factor when I started this. However, it seems that episode 11 and 12 will most likely wind up somewhere around March or April 2021, which, if we talk about the release of that episode, was exactly 10 years after it was delayed from the earthquake and tsunami. So I think it would be a safer bet than most to have episode 12 of this series premiere on April 21st, 2021. But what even is time anymore? I don't know. It seems like yesterday I was watching the show when it was airing. Also, from me to me, I did a video for Pause and Select's November video month for anime video analyses, essays, etc. So if you're interested in other people talking about other shows that are far outside my specialty, go check out his recap video, and it has a playlist to all the other content that was created for that month.
The major constructive criticism I would give is that he seems to be a little bit reticent about holding on to a frame for too long.
Oh man, if he only knew. Cow City brings up something that I definitely missed in the Sayaka train scene from episode 8. The subject matter of the shithead men. They're talking very negatively and pejoratively about a girl that tries to make her boyfriend happy, only for them to completely disregard and trample on all of her efforts. This, of course, is reflective on Sayaka and her efforts toward Kyosuke and his absolute, what should we call it, obtuseness towards what Sayaka has done for him. Once again, another great example of what I call reflective writing, and you should definitely go check out my video on A Place Further in the Universe if you want to hear more about that. I really do maintain that it should be the primary test for dialogue in any type of visual narrative medium. So I was fully expecting to receive some type of comment along this lines, and Yurigasaki comes forward with the idea that I went a little too far lauding the darkness and realism of the series in the last episode, and that plenty of other magical girl series have been as dark, if not darker, in many different ways. And yeah, absolutely, I even did a panel on dark magical girl series since 2011 and kind of the Madoka Magica blowback and what that means, and a large part of that was comparing the shows that came before Madoka Magica and how dark, scare quotes, dark they really were. And I absolutely 100% agree with the stake that Yurigasaki has put in the ground here. I did realistically over-exaggerate the influence of the Urobuchi twist factor in episode 8 because I wanted to make a point specifically about how we were taken on the ride the same as the girls, in our innocence, in our ignorance, in our expectations. And what this commenter said is mostly true, that this is kind of not the way that it is preferred that we look at these things, through the lens of dark, as in, how much tangible danger there is to the characters, or how much offensive content or anything along those lines is in the show. Nor am I in any way suggesting that a more dark or mature, scare quotes again, because what even do those mean? You could find millions of examples of, Princess Tutu or Sailor Moon elements that are just as dark and mature as anything in Madoka Magica, is in any way better qualitatively. And I really want to make sure that nobody took that message away from what I said in regards to episode 8, because I think a lot of people do go into Madoka Magica and then come out of the other side of watching it thinking, oh man, if they just make everything more grim and dark, then it's cooler and better and realer. And that's a disastrous reduction that completely oversimplifies everything and misrepresents the entire genre. That said, I do maintain the positions that I put forward at the end of episode 8, that by using these expectations that have been raised in us by watching previous magical girl shows and how they should resolve and how they should go, that by deliberately attacking these specific elements that never seem to make sense, like trusting wholeheartedly this familiar character that explains all the glamour that goes on, Urobuchi is then able to say something meaningful about the genre and how we go about accepting the genre and digesting it. And furthermore, I'll defiantly stand by the claim that a more realistic show is inherently less hopeful. Or more realistic you get, the less power these elements of believing in these fanciful positive ideals such as hope and justice and miracles and magic become. And those are the large inversions that Urobuchi plays in this show. Because at the end of the day, the appeal of all those high-minded values, our morals and everything, is that they don't function logically. They exist outside of logic, and yet we still believe in them and value them, and they still have meaning and power. So how then can we reconcile that two? How then can we say that they are worth fighting for and that they are worth believing in, and it's wrong to say not to have hope, even when we can empirically prove prove that it's wrong to have hope or foolish to have hope. And in that essence, of course, is where you find the magical girl and where they live. Again, I over-exaggerated the end of that to show the nadir of the genre that Kyubey and Urabuchi have proved to us, and proved to us extra-diegetically, that logically there is no point to have hope. What we see in this episode, and again in episode 12, is the last kicker and the last word on that. We see Kyoko come back towards the idea that it is, worth fighting for these high-minded values that Sayaka showed her. That even in the worst of situations, you can never suppress those themes, these intrinsic and positive values of humanity. We just were waiting for the other shoe to drop. And honestly, we've been waiting for the other shoe to drop the entire series. That's, again, what Madoka Magica being denied the realization of a normal magical girl show is all about. That other shoe not dropping for 8-9 episodes now. But it does, proving that logic can never deny the human spirit. As a quick add-on to that comment, Jared Mithrandir brings up the shows that I've kind of, shoved aside, like Daybreak Illusion and Magical Girl Sight, claiming that maybe they do have a little more value than I give them credit for. And yeah, I guess I could see that. And I've heard from a couple people that they did find something meaningful in their resolutions and in their themes. I don't want to gatekeep magical girls at all. That's not my intent. But if you'd like to present a position that Yuki Yuna is a Hero is a better show than Madoka Magica, I'd love to see that evidence. Same with any type of defense of Daybreak Illusion. Moving on and referencing our past discussion of the plot hole regarding the familiars creating additional witches, Homu brings in a Word of God quote from Gen Urobuchi admitting that in the first draft of the series, this wasn't the case. Familiars were added in a later draft when he realized the numbers just wouldn't add up. I don't think it tangibly hurts the show in any way to have this kind of just hand-waved away, but I think it's really cool to see behind the curtain and say that setting and plot elements are always secondary to where you need the characters to go and what you want to say in your show. Super cool. Thank you for that one, Homo. Agent T questions how Madoka made a mistake in comforting Sayaka. And yeah, this is a really subtle one that I like a lot and would like to talk about a bit more. Because it implies that there's a right way and a wrong way to think, or a right way and a wrong way to go on living. And I don't know, even with the Sayaka scene in episode 12 and everything in Rebellion, that maybe Sayaka accepting everything that went on over the course of the show and then denying Madoka's offer to reset everything or wipe it out stands in direct defiance of there being some type of magic key that Madoka could have said in the bus stop scene to unlock Sayaka. It could be, and I think Madoka Magica offers enough evidence to have this type of reading of the struggle makes everything worthwhile. But since you asked, I think there's a ton of very direct examples of when a magical girl has come across these negative ideas festering in another character, or another character obviously struggling with why go on or the purpose for their lives, and then immediately and very easily shut it down. And I 100% maintain that Madoka, had she said the right thing, could have stopped Sayaka's suicide at a couple points now, including episode 6 when I pointed it out. For examples, just go to any magical girl show and then find an episode where the bad guy is freaking out. They've been beaten magically, or they're betrayed, or something has, kind of struck them down from the place and the worldview that they have, and now they have to, navigate a crisis of faith and purpose and identity. And then just look at what the magical girl does in response, and the villain's response to that offer from the magical girl. Or it doesn't even have to be a villain. Here's one from Magic Users Club that I just saw as I was watching it.
だって私なんかいてもいなくても同じ。何をしてもしなくてもみんな同じ。同じ。違うよ、あかねちゃん。そんなことない。なんだって誰だって意味があるし、やれるんだったらやんないよりマシで、やった方がよくってだからね、誰だっているのがよくて、だからいてほしくて、だから私もなんかも魔法クラブはみんなあかねちゃんが大好き。あれ?
Here's a very obvious and unmissable one from Hugto Pretty Cure.
心が 苦しいのわかるよ。私もそうだもん。私も頑張れない時ある。宿題サボっちゃったことあるし、人参とグリーンピース避けちゃった時あるし。やめろ。大丈夫だよ。その気持ち私が抱きしめるから。
Here it is in Devilman Crybaby.
That guy's a devil!
You were like that back then, too. Akira, you were crying about my family earlier, weren't you? You haven't changed, Akira.
Thank you, Nikki.
Something like this happens in Evangelion again and again.
常に人間は心に痛みを感じている。心が痛がりだから生きるのも辛いと感じる。ガラスのように繊細だね。特に君の心は。
僕が
そう、好意に値するよ。
好意。
好きってことさ。
And here it is in Undertale. I mean, I could give you a million examples, but one that I've always really loved is episode 70 of Sailor Moon. That's after Cone is betrayed by Crimson Rubeus. Her only really purpose in existence was to chase his love. He denies her that and then gives her a bunch of power. Her worldview shattered, she just lashes out. She's basically a witch at that point. After a battle with Sailor Mars, the rest of the Sailor Scouts come in, and then Sailor Jupiter's about to finish Cone with a big knee to the chest, and then Sailor Mars jumps in to protect Cone. The idea for the story is that you just have to make whatever action they take to show them, or whatever words they say, believable enough to the person who's reeling then. And, you know, that may be a bit more difficult in the context of the bus scene, that Madoka would have had to have said something to convince Sayaka that life is worth living because she's unable to act in a way that would demonstrate to Sayaka how much value her life still has, and provide her with that type of positivity towards wanting to go on living. But I maintain it's much the same as any type of suicide situation. Almost exactly. How do you talk someone down off the ledge? Also, shoutouts once again to Christina V.
You see, now you have a chance to start anew. To begin with, you're still here, and all that was wrong before you can make right a little bit at a time.
The final comment that we'll address here is Toi Kanai coming back and saying that I am ignoring the fact that Madoka asked Homura to do what she's doing in response to me calling Homura a hypocrite in the last episode. Just as a refresher, I called Homura a hypocrite because she is sacrificing her own life to be able to deny Madoka the ability to do the same thing. Now, of course, we can talk about this again in the next episode when it comes up, but I went back and checked, and the request is in the third timeline, and it goes as follows.
Go back and change everything so that we don't end up like this. Okay? Then save me from being stupid, from getting tricked. Don't let Kyubei fool me again.
Note that, again, this is in Timeline 3, where the identity of the witch as magical girl is revealed to all the girls, and Mommy freaks out and everything like that. And immediately following this, Homura goes back and refuses to allow Kyubei even anywhere near Madoka for the entire timeline of Timeline 4. And what's more, this is not Homura's wish, although we could realistically consider it to be Homura's wish after the events of Timeline 3. But again, that's something that needs a lot more discussion to it. So what I have a problem with here, and why I call Homura a hypocrite, and I'm not going to recant on that, is not that Homura accepts this or uses this as motivation and propels her forward. No, not at all. But the way in which Homura reads this allows for her to be hypocritical about it. Madoka says she doesn't want to be tricked by Kyubei. She wants Homura to stop her from being deceived. Homura's actions in the following timelines are forcefully preventing preventing Madoka from contracting with Kyubey. Those two things are not the same. Of course, we see in episode 3 Homura try to talk it out with everybody, right? To show them the truth, right? But then Sayaka's skepticism and Mommy trying to balance things out kind of comes in and prevents them from really getting in there, or prevents that from being a positive resolution. Specifically, Sayaka asks some more, explanatory questions of why Kyubey would do that, and Homura doesn't have an answer. So to prevent the magical girls from being deceived, Homura kind of feels that it's necessary to take these violent extremist actions, to take matters into her own hands, to paint herself the villain. And while that's an understandable path that she may at least try, I don't think it's reasonable to assume that that is the only way to go about it. Yes, I do think Homura ends up being hypocritical because she refuses to talk things out, or she limits herself by writing those off, and ends up at a place of hypocrisy. The additional point Toei Kanai raises is one of a sunk cost. Homura, by that point in Timeline 3, has already contracted. As such, she feels that her life has already been wasted, and that Madoka can continue on with her blissful, ignorant, happy life, unperturbed by the magical girl curse. However, Homura cannot, so she will bear the burden for Madoka. And while that is precisely what Urobuchi wants you to think of the magical girl contract as being over the course of this show, what I am trying so very hard to get across to you in this series is that fallacy is not the truth. Once you reject the assumption of Kyubey's system that every magical girl has to turn into a witch, once you say no and realize that isn't the case, it's simply what Kyubey wants you to believe, then the sunk cost is no more. This is literally what happens in episode 12. Turning into a witch is abandoning everything that is meaningful to fight for, or giving up on those values. If you don't do that, you don't turn into a witch. And by finding a new purpose, by moving forward as Homura does in the last shot of the series, one can continue to be a magical girl, continue to have a purpose in their life. This is exactly the same issue that was brought up earlier about how do we save Sayaka in the bus stop scene, by convincing them that there is something to fight for and that they're not alone. And it is all worthwhile in the end. Signing the contract isn't a death sentence, as Homura believes it to be, and by rejecting the assumptions, rejecting the things you've taken for granted and what you've been told, by believing in justice and holding a determination to fist, you can fulfill the request that Madoka asks for. But again, the series, and this episode in particular, is very much about the struggle to get there and not the end destination. Still, to respond to Toei Kanai, maybe hypocritical was a little bit unfair to Homura's situation. Certainly she's done more than could be expected. Anyway, she's not the focus of this episode. Let's move forward with the resolution of the storyline of Sayaka Miki and Kyoko Sakura. Some miscellanea for episode 9 of Madoka Magica. We've mentioned so far how difficult it's been to pin down any one specific element as attributable to anyone in particular at Shaft, well, aside from Urobuchi. However, this episode was definitively storyboarded by Akiyuki Shinbo under a pseudonym. Not that I think I'll be doing any specific comparisons, but if you ever want to, this would be the episode that you would look at, re his directing style. Also, the famous ending song, the Kyoko Sayaka duet that seems to be more of a character insert song and doesn't really fit the pacing of an airing show, was only added in the Blu-ray version, and the TV airing version doesn't contain that song, nor does Magia play. Instead, the ending scene features the dialogue between Kyubey and Homura, and that is played over the credits instead. That's really only relevant because I think a lot of the success of the latter half of Madoka Magica stems from its pacing. These last few episodes have picked up right where the previous one left off. That little to no gap even between the scenes themselves chronologically makes it feel like one, of course, a more cinematic experience, but also one that is going to require you to have watched all previous episodes to understand it. I've been going back through a couple archive threads from 2011, and the level of anticipation and hype that can be found in those threads, it's really something else. Of course, a lot of it is trying to suss out what's happening mechanically in the show, what the plot plot twist is going to be, especially before episode 10's reveal and the delay on episode 11 and 12's airing. But I don't want to discredit the contiguous pace of this story. It really does matter for how effective it was, especially when it comes to talking about rebellion and everything that went into creating rebellion. It's important that we begin to talk a little bit more about how immensely popular Madoka Magica became, and these tantalizing cliffhangers are certainly part of the reason why. In the episode itself, we see Octavia's name displayed as she first appears. By this time, by the way, the airing watchers had determined that the runes were just a very simple replacement cipher for the Latin alphabet, and we were able to see everybody's names. So too are all the musical staffs displayed to be Octavia's theme, which we hear prominently, of course, in this episode. We talked in depth about her design in an earlier episode of this breakdown, so let's talk a little bit about her labyrinth. I like in this episode that we see the checkerboard pattern come back into play. This could reference a number of things: the black and white motif that we saw in episode 8, chess pieces on a chessboard in the way that she has been played or failed to play the game correctly. The warping could indicate how the structured, rigid way she looked at the world has now been turned topsy-turvy, and I think a lot of the curved lines in her labyrinth do have that element to them. However, I think the biggest reference for the checkerboard pattern here is episode 1, this infinite void that Madoka runs through in Homura's memories, or a past timeline, or Madoka's dream, all of the above. Sayaka now stuck in that same nowhere, that same nothingness. Could we equate then Madoka being left unable to have any agency by Homura's actions to being trapped in a witch, trapped as a witch, or whatever state Sayaka is currently in? I like that one because it feeds into this idea of the systemic inequities that Kyubey is forcing on the humans. I've made reference again and again of this being how they buy into the system in a very much an Utena-esque way. The systemic reduction and oppression of the girls and magical girls to produce them as witches or garner their transformation and their energy therein is of course perpetrated by Kyubey, but also in fact enabled by a number of the girls that buy into the system, such as Kyoko and Homura, believing that it is the system that they're working within. And again, I question the idea, the axiom that it can't be changed or it can't be moved, or that they need to play around inside of it. Well, here, like episode 1, we see what happens when a character is left to languish inside of this system. Shinbo here wastes no time with some really dynamic and catchy shots, using the obtuse geography, the Inukuri designs as sort of a playground to do things like wipe with the music staves, to have us lost without an element of grounding, but then very quickly focus our attentions on these important elements. Sayaka's body falling is definitely one of these, and the very quick zoom out as Kyoko goes in to catch Sayaka's body in front of Octavia. However, in spite of all the confusion, Shinbo retains this very strong directionality here, that Octavia is placed either in the center or to the left, and the girls are moving towards her, and then they run away back and to the right. Again, in our basic directionality reading, the left is progress, and now Octavia sits right in front of the girls. And her being so central really fits with this episode. It's entirely about dealing with Octavia, and she's certainly not hidden from the viewer, even if we don't understand what it is we're seeing. Kyoko's catch panning right in front of Octavia's face and into her scream is another one of my favorite little bits. We are forced by Shinbo to get this very close look up of this grotesque Inukuri mashup of this witch, of these elements that don't go together at all, and how off-putting it is right as it screams directly at the girl. Note here that this is Sayaka's voice actor screaming, and this was re-recorded in different languages, using Sayaka's voice actor in that language. I know you've come to expect my opinions on the dubbing process here, and I will happily oblige by saying that Sarah Ann Williams destroys for Sayaka throughout most of the show. However, this moment, I think, or maybe the processing on her scream, is really one line that just absolutely misses. It doesn't really sound like an eldritch abomination screaming, just kind of like a girl. See if you can hear it for yourself. But then I suppose I want to ask you, I want to question you, if you are the ADR director or even the actual director for this episode. For reference, that was Masahiro Mukai. They were the assistant director on the show and would later direct things like the Neptunia anime. If you're sitting there in the booth directing Eri Kitamura on how to deliver this line, what do you have in your head for the sound that you want? Do you want it a kaiju scream, or do you want it to be recognizable as a girl? And it's no surprise that such a subtle decision would get lost in the dubbing process, or that a different director would have a different point of view on how the line should be delivered. And here I even went through the trouble of downloading a couple other languages too, just purely for our edification. And can I just say, like, props to the Italian community because of how easy it was to find the Italian dub, whereas all the other dubs were pretty hard, until I realized I could just bring it up on Netflix and then change the dub language. But lest you think this dubbing rambling has had no point, I'll hit you with the Urobuchi twist and tell you that this scream from Octavia is the entire point of the episode. That because no one can understand Sayaka and her feelings and what she's going through, that she has been a failure to communicate her wants and desires onto the world, that she was not able to connect to others, and manifest her choices and who she was onto the world. She has now literally become that. Failure to communicate is suicide, is death. Is it so hard to believe that humans as social creatures would need the ability to make their desires and their choices known unto the world, and see the repercussions of those, and see that those are meaningful, and believe that to be able to go on living? That somehow stripping those away or denying people the ability to believe that they have this agency, that they can affect the world, would be something that destroys a human being's soul, because it directly attacks what a human being is. I always love media that gets at very core issues to the human experience, and what's more core than making a statement that the only thing we are, the only thing that truly matters, is wanting to be understood by other people and understanding other people in turn. Having someone say, yes, that's justified, that's reasonable. We love and support you because we value your choices, we value your positions, and coming into contact with them and learning more about you and what you have done, more importantly, why you have done it, creates value to me as a human being. You exist, and I recognize that, and I love you for it. And now we've arrived back at that question from the comments of how do you save Sayaka? Well, you listen to her, and you understand, and you vindicate her by supporting her. And we come to the idea of why Kyoko and Madoka are unable to turn her back from being a witch. Because it requires hearing her and understanding her in a very specific way where she is at, not where you want her to be. So for my self-established metrics that I talked about last episode for what makes for good visual storytelling, the verisimilitude of having a character unable to express themselves or have their worldview legitimized, and then turning them into an unrecognizable monster who screams unintelligible things that we're not even sure is sapient, is the best metaphor conceivable. We can talk about her design, we can talk about Symposium Magarum, but what really makes Sayaka's despair real to the viewer is this likely subconscious connection between a character that consistently gets misunderstood and put off and marginalized, then literally turning into, on screen, a manifestation of disenfranchisement and pain and sorrow. If all you see her as now is an irredeemable witch, as Homura does in this scene, then you too are falling into that same systemic trap Kyubei and Urobuchi set up. Thankfully, we have Kyoko here to guide us through this episode, and her role is to deny that interpretation. Okay, before we get back on tracks and literally start talking about the train symbology, I also want to say that this is tagged as psychological fear and suicide, which really gives some weight to the idea that becoming a witch is equivalent in some way to a suicide. And I just want to brag in some way that I was vindicated by Netflix's trigger tagging system. The train tracks in Octavia's Labyrinth have a number of identifiable symbols that couple along with them. The fact that she murdered 2 men on the train tracks, that her transformation occurred in the train station, all kind of tie back into it. But those are really born from what happens in episode 8. I think there's something a little more intrinsic to these. The symbol of the train track is reflective of a different path that could have been taken. It's very well realized in something like Mawaru Penguin Drum, where you see it used for these split world lines or different things that could happen if only the timeline had diverged here and not there. Honestly, it's a symbol that comes up in a ton of Japanese media. You could go back to like Steins Gate has a train track scene, Disappearance has a big train theme, and that's probably due to how integral trains are to Tokyo and Japanese daily life in general. The wiki wants to make a connection to the Wheel tarot card, which, not being a fan of tarot myself, I could possibly see. However, I think that the wheels specifically are used in a different kind of Japanese pun, and I may be overreaching here and it may have less of a connection than the tarot one does, but I like to bring up the Japanese word katawa. It literally means crippled or deformed, or imperfect or incomplete, as you can see. However, the actual kanji for the word break down as one-sided wheel. So it literally has the reading of one wheel as well. It's a very offensive word, of course, in the same way that crippled is, but I do think there's enough here to make a reading that it is connected in some way to all the single wheels that we see thrown out by Octavia. The funny thing is that Sayaka is not crippled. Literally. You may remember Katawa Shoujo, which is a visual novel based on this idea and some drawings from Raita, featuring blind and paraplegic or otherwise crippled, literally, girls. Sayaka Miki is about as far from crippled as you could possibly be. In fact, her powers of healing make sure that she is never resigned to that fate. There's also this reading that she made a wish for a crippled person, which would be reason enough to put the one-wheeled symbols into her labyrinth, of course. But can we also kind of like extend it further and say that no, she's not physically crippled. She cannot be physically crippled in any way. She even healed the physical disabilities. And yet somehow this curse, this association with the act of being disabled has come back to haunt her. And in this, I kind of lean towards the other meaning of the word, imperfect or incomplete. Though she effectively shielded herself from being crippled, she still managed to end up being emotionally crippled. I think if the reading I put forth is in fact substantial enough to be considered something meaningful, then what this says for Sayaka is that her wish in some way betrayed her. Healing the surface level issue did not address these other issues. The very same thing that Mamiya warns her about in episode 3. I feel like it's a bit of a contrivance to make them leave the Witch's Labyrinth right now, and I think that Urabuchi realizes this as well because he has a number of lines here of Homura saying, drop that dead body, and then we'll go back and kill it right quick. But that would make not the best episode, so I completely understand why he does it. And once again, that Homura is stuck in this mindset where Sayaka is irredeemable now, she's a witch, there's nothing to be done, there's no way to change her fate, and having her manifest her ideas as dialogue. Kind of see a lot of that in the after credits scene. I don't think this one's particularly great as a scene, it's really Homura expositing. There's a lot of really Shinbo-esque things, a lot of hair flips, a couple really useful close-ups, again indicating that this is a more personal or integral thing that's being dealt with. The only moderate symbol is again the extension of the train tracks, which carry on the meaning that we talked earlier about the labyrinth and really tie it in spatially to the labyrinth. However, they're used to great effect when the realization that Sayaka is dead hits Maruka. She actually gets hit in the background of the scene by an incoming train. It's kind of like that Mean Girls joke of it hit me like a big yellow school bus. The last little visual symbol here is the wind shaking things back and forth, but in kind of an aftershock kind of vibe. Though it has been a symbol that's been associated with these girls, particularly Sayaka, over the course of the show, and we did first identify it in episode 4, here now it kind of feels like maybe the wake of Sayaka's shout, or the wake of her influence and her change being spread out into the world, and these ripples being felt. We could also, too, attribute a bit of directionality to Homura and Kyoko Kyoko leaving the labyrinth and heading to the right side of the screen, where Madoka, trying to understand Sayaka, trying to move forward to the left. Though I think Shinbo and everybody on the course of Madoka Magica has done much more of a job with centering objects and really not putting too much of an emphasis on shot composition as such. But if we do maintain the directionality right quickly, we see in this shot here when Kyoko grabs Homura, she's then positioned on the same side that Madoka was coming from, right as she starts talking about, can't you have a little empathy? Can't you understand how she's feeling? That was her best friend, indicating that these are the values that will kind of move you towards the left and towards progress. And of course, that's really the only other thing I want to talk about this short scene is that Kyoko defends the emotional aspect here. So now we see Homura foiling Kyoko in much the same way that Kyoko was foiling Sayaka earlier, stating that, emotions are silly. We need a logical point of view here. Now, because of this gradual interaction with Sayaka, Kyoko has taken up the mantle for some of what Sayaka believed. This Kyoko Sakura is not the same as Kyoko Sakura from the end of episode 4. Now, of course, we get the scene dealing with how we are going to rationalize away Kyubey even being in this show anymore. It is such an objectively evil character by any reasonable reckoning that we're really eager here to know how it's going to interact, if it interacts at all, with the girls. This episode, for what it's worth, has a very strong chronological feel, or temporal sense about it. We see a couple explicit shots already of clocks showing that all occurred with Sayaka a little after midnight, and then here at about 3 a.m. we're with Madoka. I think one of the real big strengths that I think we've pointed out going through this show is that they'll do a couple really quick establishing shots before each scene. And this one in particular on Madoka is one of my favorites because it tells you everything that you need to know about what Madoka is feeling, what the tone of this scene is going to be, and it also really provides this kind of slight pause to catch your breath and really think back on everything that Homura just said about not really being human. How concrete that was. And how confident she was in it. Again, the symbols of the empty chairs, the symbols of Kyubey as plush doll, things we talked in earlier episodes of this series. I can't imagine that you decided to come in on episode 9, but if you did, hello. Listen, I'm not going to give you a breakdown of Kyubey's explanation of thermodynamics. For as fun as that would be, it simply just doesn't matter. Instead, I'll tell you this really famous story from the production of Jurassic Park, when Steven Spielberg was told by the person on the set responsible for continuity that the T-Rex scene didn't happen near a cliff earlier in the film, and there's no reason there should be a cliff right by the T-Rex film later. He specifically told that continuity person to ignore it. It doesn't matter because nobody's going to realize it. So yes, for those of you who have your PhD in physics and can explain to us in detail why this is not an accurate representation of entropy, even if we acknowledge that magical girls or teenage girls would have the ability to create energy through their emotions, it doesn't matter to any of us watching. This isn't an explanation of entropy. This is an explanation of the circumstances that are preventing the magical girls from having their magical girl show. It is a twist revelation for Kyubey. As such, it only needs to pass the believability test to the average viewer, which honestly I think it does totally fine. What's more interesting in the whole Urabuchi kind of plot hole, putting it all together kind of way, is the accumulation of different bits that kind of do affect elements in the story. Like what we were talking about in a couple of the comments with Kyubey's refusal to acknowledge the social structures of the world, or ostensibly deliberate misinterpretation of culture and engaging with human beings. So if we start with the concept, that's actually a really brilliant concept, that emotions can be converted into energy, then we would need to explain why Kyubey can't use their own emotions to convert to energy and need to go through all this trouble with the magical girls. Of course, I'd bet any amount of money Gen Urabuchi didn't start at the idea of wouldn't it be cool to convert emotions into energy and then write a story from there. Of course, Shinbo had the idea for Madoka Magica of doing a different magical girl take and taking down some of the elements of magical girls. Like it's word of God established that he came to Urabuchi and said, could you write a story about magical girls? So in that way, you have to kind of look at the magical girl things, look at the magical girl tropes, and then work backwards to say, how can we attack them? Or how can we make a story where we make make a couple twists around them. In the pursuit of that, making emotions actually have this tangible weight to them in a way that I think we talked about in episode 2, I believe, with the power allotted in many magical girl shows towards the empathic value of items and people, not only fits in line with the genre itself and would feel totally natural in a magical girl show because of the established precedent, but then allows us to kind of create this twist related to magical girls becoming the monsters of the day that they're fighting in the pursuit of capturing this mystical empathic energy. So once Urobuchi has put that together and made this kind of a big twist right here at the end of Madoka Magica, then he can kind of work backwards towards, well, what kind of character would I use to create that type of situation? Or what would their motivations be for using teenage girls to do that? And then you could obviously go back and fill out all of this speech in episode 9 here. A couple other things. When Kyubei mentions the humans, all the shots of the other chairs really imply that other magical girls have been there and heard this speech before, which of course they have, and of course is a large part of Madoka Magica. We also talked in length, I believe, at the start of the previous episode regarding the ability for Kyubei to deceive other people intentionally, which it does a number of times throughout the show. So as I said in the previous episode, I really don't buy into the idea that Kyubei is unable to grok the concept of deceiving. What I of course want to put the focus on, and I think what the show wants to put the focus on, is the direct and intentional conflict in how these people are talking, how Madoka responds to Kyubei's exposition dump. This is also pursuant to everything we talked about with Madoka being the heart of the show, or telling us where we should feel as we go through Madoka Magica. But I think it's most evident on Kyubei's final line of, if you ever feel like dying for the sake of the universe, come see me. You know, this very cheery tune. And I guess the last thing I kind of want to say about the whole plot setup for Madoka Magica is that it feels like a magical girl setup through and through. This is not deviant at all. In fact, I'm reminded of my favorite moments in magical girl shows like Duck throwing the locket away, or in the start of Sailor Moon R when Luna has to give Usagi back all of her memories and she doesn't want to do it because she doesn't want to put the burden back on Usagi. Isn't that what you do as a magical girl? Don't you end up dying for the sake of what you believe in and defending the world that you love? So really, in the totality of all of this, and which is why I think Urobuchi did such a good job with putting this plot construct together, that it feels, yes, like a betrayal, and yes, like an inversion of, you know, the small helper animal is a good character, but also it feels totally in line with magical girl ethos. That really extends to the following scene with Kyoko as well. The kind of common perception of this scene is that Kyubei is baiting Kyoko into doing something stupid by giving deliberately vague answers that kind of imply that there might be a hope to turn Sayaka back. Instead, what I'll say to you is that I see this more as a reaffirmation that we're still operating within a magical girl sphere. I would be really scared if Kyubei had said, yes, of course there's a way to do it, because then it's more plot bullshit. Then it's not a miracle. So for me now, as magical girl fan, as Kyoko is, and she says later in this episode, this isn't a bait to me. To me, this is a confirmation that somebody who believes in miracles and, you know, truly believes in them enough to make them exist would absolutely be able to turn Sayaka back, which we see, right? Like it could happen. Absolutely. Earlier in episode 8, we had the idea that Madoka could have done it in a heartbeat. And yeah, with her wish at the end of episode 12, she absolutely could have done it. Or Kyoko probably could have done it too, but that we'll get to that in the scene when they go talk to Octavia. Right now, all I'm thinking is all of those redemptive scenes throughout all magical girl shows that seemed impossible and that went through because of the power of love and friendship and compassion and understanding. And yeah, sure, this could be, finally, where Madoka Magica turns the corner. There's not much in the Hitomi scene other than Madoka's decision to go to Kyoko. Now, you might think that's nothing. However, the preceding shot, we see Homura standing on a building. Her objective, of course, to be Madoka's guardian angel and establish this everyday idyllic lifestyle, to not let anything interfere with that. And she keeps trying to interfere with that because of how much she cares and everything. So yet again, this is another decision for Madoka to reject Homura's offer and instead pursue what she believes to be important to her, which is trying to help other people. I think the transition is a lot of bit of Shimbo right here with the single drop falling and the ripple. Yeah, definitely calling back to Sayaka's tear at the end of episode 8. Definitely giving a feel of this kind of last desperate attempt, but overall a little bit too artsy for me. That extends to the following scene of the wind chimes of the mermaid and the unicorn representing the witch forms of both Kyoko and Sayaka. It feels real monogatari. It's fine though, because I really love the dialogue in this scene. Kyoko's line sets the scene for what I was saying earlier. Madoka asks if there's a way, and Kyoko says, if there wasn't, would you just leave her like that? It's this self-evident notion that if you see some injustice in the world, you have to go correct it. You have this obligation. If you care about someone, you would do whatever it takes for them. Kyoko's making this self-evident claim that Madoka values Sayaka enough to want to pursue whatever could possibly work. So I love this scene because Kyoko floats this idea of magic bullshit would turn her back, and that somehow this concept of these positive values and, positive emotions could somehow break through the magic and the nonsense of the system that they are in, and then create a positive reality for them, or have a positive outcome. And that's what it is, right? That's why in episode 4, when Sayaka says, yeah, miracles and magic are real, that's what that means. It means having belief, having hope, having an earnest desire to trust in those values enough and in their inherent purpose and inherent meaning enough to make them part of how you act. And then paradoxically, that is the only thing you need to cut through and affect the hard crunch, the science, the Cube level plot structure of the story that these girls are in. Kyoko here is a true magical girl. And when Madoka buys into Kyoko's speech, we see a second drop fall. So there's 2 drops of hope in a puddle. And I absolutely love that the scene ends on Madoka's introduction and Kyoko handing over an item of food to her, symbolizing that they have made a friendship now, because that ties it back to the magical girl canon in a way that feels incredibly tangible. And it's demonstrative of how the themes that Kyoko was just talking about were so inherent to what we know as a magical girl. It's why I feel going into their fight with Octavia that, oh man, this could be when Madoka Magica finally lets the other shoe drop. The last bit about this scene is it is a scene that I constantly reference in other media or when I'm talking about other shows, because I think it hits so well the idea of diegetic distance that we had referenced even at the start of episode 1. This is the most play-esque scene I think in the entire show. It is the most kind of Willy Loman talking about how life is rough. It is the most stage manager, our town, saints and poets maybe. Kind of philosophizing within the show, referencing other stuff, kind of the Greek choir kind of stepping back and saying stuff that kind of just barely reaches in the realm of inside the story itself. If you don't relate or have this personal connection to Kyoko's line about I loved those stories when I was young, the stories where love and justice triumphs, what in the world are you doing watching this show? And I don't do that to be dismissive of mean or disregarding other interpretations of Madoka Magica as a show. However, I do hold it up as a trump card here. It's so integral and so obvious and so clearly stated right in front of you. How could it be denied that we are supposed to feel like Kyoko and Madoka do in this scene? Thank you for coming to my TED Talk about Madoka Magica as a magical girl show. Moving on, the Homura scene gives us a bit of a pacing beat away from Kyoko and Madoka, is also a quick little joke, and then of course an episode 10 and episode 1 callback. I like the idea though that it portrays this school as where Madoka could have gone, right? And then that is in some way choosing Homura, or choosing what Homura wants for her as legitimate, and Madoka has denied Homura here. It's very good for for the emotional outbursts that she has later with Madoka. The shots aren't amazing finding Octavia's labyrinth here, but the dialogue really is. Madoka again raises the idea that they should work together. She's been on the same broken record track as since episode 2. It really gives the impression that kind of the ultimate answer, or the way that this whole story is going to be resolved, is by Madoka kind of solving this puzzle of why the girls aren't working together, or why these circumstances don't behave like any traditional post-Sailor Moon magical girl team. That if she could just get everybody on the same page and aligned, then none of this would have happened, which we've identified in a couple points to be the critical error of the girls: failure to communicate, failure to be understood, failure to work together and understand others. Again, we've got the industrial theming, which ties back into the other circumstances where we brought it up in the past and how different it is from the natural riverbank essence that we associated with Sayaka as flourishing. And the one really money shot is Kyoko having eaten the dango, throwing then the kebabs down into the ground and having them pierce into a graffiti that says, "Love me do," with an emoji. Now, I saw on the wiki that people have interpreted it as a misinterpretation of "Love Me Too" from Sayaka, but honestly I think that's kind of misunderestimating the staff at Shaft here. I mean, they did a whole witch labyrinth language and got German writing accurate. I think they know a difference between a T and a D. Instead, come on, it's gotta be a reference to the Beatles song. While they didn't play "Love Me Do" in '66 at Budokan, it's not like Japanese people didn't know Beatles songs. "Love Me Do" was recorded 2 years after Shinbo was born. So if we operate under the assumption that this is indeed referencing the song, what can we then make of Kyoko impaling it and the accompanying emoji face? Well, one, it's paid a ton of attention to, right? It gets its own shot and emphasis and action onto it, so it's gotta have some meaning. But the song in and of itself doesn't contain any meaning past, Paul McCartney being a 16-year-old angsty teen and it being very simple. In fact, the song's so easy to play on guitar that the only reason it's notable is the harmony in the vocals and the harmonica. Now, none of those are real big things that could tie into Sayaka specifically. However, the harmony could be said to be Madoka and Kyoko teaming up. And I like the idea of some type of duality because Kyoko very specifically tosses 2 dango sticks into the heart. I think the only other thing I could really draw out of this is that "Love Me Do" is such a universal idea, right? It's so simple that all Sayaka wanted was to be loved. And isn't that what we talked about in the beginning of the episode of how do you save Sayaka? How do you do the magical girl thing onto Sayaka? It is written as a plea to somebody looking for some love, some type of acceptance and validation from another person, which of course translates perfectly onto Sayaka. So then this symbol of them throwing these 2 spears at it feels to me like what Madoka and Kyoko are going to do to Sayaka over the course of this attempt at redemption. And we'll get to that when we get in there. Going into the labyrinth is a bit of weird dialogue because we see Kyoko tell Madoka that Homura's position is valid. That's pretty crazy and really pulls Madoka away from throwing herself at the issue. There's this taffy being pulled apart here for Madoka Kaname, that on one end she wants to make the world a better place, and that is her neutral good vibes, her impetus to go and die for something meaningful. And then on the other end is Homura espousing the values of grace, of enjoy your life together with your happy family and idyllic circumstances. And it's been kind of the undercurrent of Madoka's issues over the course of the entire show. But that said, this again is kind of painted as this taffy pull when it certainly doesn't have to be, or we've seen that be a false dichotomy in other magical girl shows. So her escaping on the z-axis from this x-axis pull that's thinning her out is what needs to happen, or what needs to go on to get Madoka to the point where she can be a manifested human being that has the ability to say, yes, because I value that so much that I will sacrifice it and find a new, fresh happiness to, if not replace it, then substitute for it. And the ultimate realization is built in these moments of tension. And while it's a good character arc, what it also is this idea of choice. Kyoko does the exactly Homura thing of threatening to deny Madoka her agency by force. And in fact, it's the same warning that Mami gave. But we see in episode 12 when she talks to those two after making her wish that she says, I know what I'm doing. I know what the circumstances are, and I'm making an informed decision to sacrifice that happiness that had been protected for me by Homura, by Kyoko, by Mami, by Sayaka, and I'm going to do so with the intent to create my own life that I want to lead using this power that I have. It's the idea that you don't let your wish reduce you, but you use your wish to manifest to who you want to be. This is the crucial distinction between being deceived and knowing the circumstances and doing it anyway. That is why Junko and Mami and Kyoko and yes, even Homura come to support Madoka. But again, much more for episode 12. Madoka again begins to ask Kyoko why she became a magical girl, ostensibly, which is cute because we already know it, and, you know, it would inform Madoka of why Kyoko feels the way she does and would create more compassion, and is just not the point of this story. And then we kind of get thrust in a really cool way of the labyrinth moving around them right in front of Octavia with her front and center. The elements of Octavia's labyrinth should be really, really obvious, especially because they're called back in episode 12, and we've seen so much of Sayaka's story, and even in Rebellion too, like over the course of her controlling Octavia in there, that we really get it. Like, she's conducting this orchestra, right? We saw her watching Kyosuke as a child. We saw the seats. We see the seats again in episode 12. We see the music theme that we have that's very much a violin theme. It very much matches her theme as a magical girl in the way that it kind of spirals, rising and falling and spinning back around and around, which also fits nicely in the circular element of the room, but also the wheels that are spun. So now we get to talk about why this doesn't work, or why this isn't the redemption in episode 9 that we were led to believe over the start of this episode. And I had thought about this for quite some time, and when we were talking about things in previous episodes, I came back to this scene and took a look at it, and really thought about what it was here that denies this on a catharsis level. It's exactly the same thing of when we analyzed why does Mami die? What is her character flaw that elicits this type of demise? And for Mami, that was her prejudice against Homura. For Kyoko and Madoka here, I thought that I might have to dig on the level of what I did with Mami on episode 3. It wasn't initially apparent, but here, just watching it back with this in mind, I think it's totally apparent. They just do a poor job. They fail to understand what Sayaka's feelings are. Listen, I literally just got done watching my favorite movie of all time, The Disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya, which has the exact same thing happen. Kyon, at the end, tries to confront Yuki, and he says the same thing of, don't do this, Yuki. You're this type of person. You're this role that I see you in, and we should just go back to the way it was before. And spoilers, but that's such a wrong answer that the show punishes Kyon extremely harshly. So too is it here. What Madoka says is this.
I know you never wanted to hurt anyone. You said you wanted to be a hero, remember? Please, Sayaka, turn back into your old self!
Boy, is that the wrong fucking thing to say to Sayaka. Don't you remember those values that you wanted to uphold that were shown to be impossible to achieve and didn't really have any meaning towards you? Don't you remember how those desires reduced you and consumed you? Please, Sayaka, remember how bad your wish was. Kyoko, too, says the same exact thing. Didn't you say you believed in your power? All that would do is remind Sayaka of how much she lost and how far she fell. The ridiculous irony of this scene is that Kyoko comes close. She comes so incredibly close to something that would turn Sayaka back from being a witch, would address her despair, and could possibly move her back towards a hopeful future. And that's her internal monologue right before saying that line, where she talks about respecting Sayaka's strength, where she says she understands that she can't forgive people for what happened to her. What she needs to do is relate and understand those emotions and convey that she does to Sayaka, to hug her and let her be a shoulder to cry on instead of cutting off her arm. And her last speech too towards Sayaka, you see that Octavia stops attacking. When she says, "I understand, I'm here with you, I will be beside you." And I think the large close-up on Octavia's head shows that this reaches Sayaka in some way. If Kyoko had saw that as the path, or figured out, or had the emotional intelligence to pursue that as her plan, then maybe something like that could have happened. Maybe there could have been some redemption here in the way of a traditional magical girl show. In fact, we actually have canonical fucking proof that that would have happened. Do you remember the moment in Rebellion where Sayaka thanks Kyoko? Is that not evidence that Kyoko's last plea reaches Sayaka here? Or am I just being overly romantic? Well, if you think that, let me say to you, there's a symbol that happens immediately after Nagisawa interrupts it with the cheese joke, and that symbol is the single teardrop falling and splattering, just like we saw earlier in this episode. Honestly, I think all of this kind of leads to a similar outcome, or is answering the same question that is really integral to what we're talking about. And it's that question of how do you save Sayaka, or what is a witch, or what goes on in the monster of the day element here of being a witch. What staves off the suicide? And there it is. Here it is. Literally right here. A manifestation in actuality of what redemption looks like within the universe established by Madoka Magica. It's all just loving and caring for another person and appreciating them and their values. That something better than an ordinary happiness exists, and the realization that even though you do sacrifice to become a magical girl, you are also granted some new special form of happiness that can replace it. As for the actual mechanics of this fight scene, I'm sorry to disappoint, but I don't have too much to say. Octavia is certainly central, large, and imposing, though most of the screen time goes to Kyoko, understandably. But it's just mostly all in service of establishing a situation where we feel it is justified that Kyoko would go full-on swan song here. And all the impact in action totally serves to do that. I think mostly, though, it's the fact of these two inner monologues coupled between these pleas outwardly to Sayaka that we discussed, as one being very strong and very core to what needs to happen, and the other being a weak attempt at what she thinks would help Sayaka. And I think it's convenient, too, that while Kyoko is, trying to reason with Octavia out loud, there's all these shots of the impacts and the violence, and none of it's really meaningful. But then over top of these very intricate scenes, the prayer to God and then the understanding of Sayaka, you get some beautiful artwork. In fact, I have trouble thinking up shots that are more poignant, expressive, purposeful, and beautiful than the blood mixing together. It is my favorite shot of the show, and probably in my top 5 of all time. By being the blood that spilled from Kyoko, it says so much about sacrifice and how they share their pain, or she understands Sayaka's pain. And it's this perfect resolution of the growth of the characters. We had said that Kyoko is a character deliberately set out to foil Sayaka's worldview. However, we see here in this final moment with the two that Kyoko's nature as a foil was just surface level, and once they got past that, it revealed a deeper understanding that they were so similar. Of course, that's what Madoka's been arguing for this entire show. That's what any magical girl show would champion. Though Kyoko is not equipped to talk it out and really reach an understanding with Sayaka, she nonetheless does at the price of her life. What can we say about Kyoko's death scene then? Having already established that the mechanics of the magic of the world put her in a situation where it seems like she would need to pull this last trigger, we say that she doesn't die as a witch. She never falls into despair because Kyoko's character never falls into despair. She goes immediately from her worldview of the food chain into finding another purpose that she's willing to live and die for. And the power of living for somebody that you truly do care about is certainly enough to stave off any absurdities and despair. It's very much like we have to have that scene at the bus stop before Sayaka can turn into a witch, otherwise she would still have the idea of living for Madoka's sake and protecting Madoka to carry her through. This, I think, is why Kyoko is the character in the show that is closest to how I feel or how I would live life. There's a pragmatism here, but there's an ability to change your mind and realize when you may have been wrong. And then in doing so, redefine who you are, what you value, and what you want in life. Who you want to be, all while still maintaining the same drive and passion to see your will realized. And seeing the growth of her finding something that she's willing to die for, some purpose that she's willing to give her entire existence towards, makes her so understandable as a character. Of course, this will come up in episode 10, where we see the exact same thing happen with Homura. And of course, the exact same thing happen with Madoka. And that's all put into Kyoko's last speech to Homura in this episode. What's more is that having heard her backstory in the show itself and seen it vividly before our eyes, her last prayer to God, where she states her life sucked, that she really had no type of grace of that normal schoolgirl life to live for in her world. It further gives legitimacy to why she would tell Madoka to value that, and why Homura would be so adamant in protecting it. The other thing she says is, "Let me have a happy dream," implying that she has no reverence for reality and would much rather forget all that. That's not who she was or what she values anymore. There's a positivity to this act, a looking forward, a simple statement that living a baseless and purposeless life, only existing for existing's sake, is far worse than dying for something meaningful. And then there's also the element, the final word of Madoka Magica: you are not alone. Through the multitudes of different elements that can contribute to what we know as a magical girl show, it seems that Madoka Magica wants to single this one out in particular. And the show, having now set up Homura as alone in every sense of the word, will further leverage this. The next episode even is called I Won't Rely on Anyone Anymore. So all told, what then is episode 9? Why would I make a claim like it's even better than episode 10? Well, it's the resolution of the storyline that we've seen play out of Sayaka and Kyoko. It's yet again another bump in the road for this show, getting back on track to becoming what it initially promised itself to be. In these two aspects, it's both a tragedy and kind of a bittersweet resolution that, yes, the miracle didn't occur right here in this instance for reasons we talked about earlier, but the show is not in the same place that it was at the end of episode 8. There's now a statement back towards Urobuchi. There was these two genre-aware characters putting faith again in the ability for something miraculous and magical to happen, implying that whatever you can do, you can never quash the ability for human beings to have hope. No amount of lolly torture porn or genocide or logic is going to quash the ability or resolute tenacity of the human race. And for all the times the show may shoot it down, for all the scenes that portray us, the audience, as foolish along with these characters, not only do we have some sort of confidence that hope will eventually break through and create a brighter future, but also the sad small comfort of that bittersweet ending, the character insert song that is in the Blu-ray version that is the ending theme for this episode, that in some way Sayaka and Kyoko grew or learned more about each other, about the world, and in doing so they arrive somewhere closer to some sort of universal truth in purpose, truth in identity, and truth in each other. So when we next see the characters, for their last episode cameo, or again when they're made full in Rebellion, we know that these are now adults, that they've overcome this issue, that they can now stand up to the absurdity of the world, side by side, hand in hand, for each other. Episode 9 may be a tragedy, it may be objectively a loss, but I don't and I never have really seen it as that. Instead, it's an event, one that you learn from, that you take and you make part of yourself and say, I am now wiser for having experienced this, for having seen this story and taken its message to heart. And I, like the girls, have now found some type of more integral and axiomatic truth that will forever and always become part of how I view the world. And proof, then, that our struggles do have meaning, and our stories of love and justice, where compassion and understanding triumph, those are not a farce. And though people may try to tell us not to have hope, that believing in others is pointless, we will always reject those ideas. One of my favorite songs is from one of my least favorite franchises. It doesn't fit tonally with this episode, but it fits thematically. And even in spite of it not coming to fruition in this episode, I'm still left thinking that I do believe in miracles, and I swear I've seen a few. So I hope by the end of this video series you'll be able to see my point of view, because I believe in second chances. That's why I believe in you. Join us next time as we continue our discussion on Madoka Magica, accumulating with the most famous and most integral episode, Episode 10.
Next up, we have Pueli Magi Homura Akime. Akime. Huh.